Welcome to the Integrated Wellbeing YouTube channel and podcast for people in grief and the professionals who serve them. We are here to provide education, inspiration, and practical tools for our audience by interviewing those bereaved by loss, mental health professionals, and grief specialists. Our mission at the Integrated Wellbeing Institute is to awaken the griever to their inner peace through the guidance of their body. And today I am absolutely delighted to welcome my friend and colleague from many years, Dr. Terri Daniel. So good morning, Terri.
Hi, Georgena. How many years have we known each other?
Oh, Terri, I think it's probably been at least a decade and a half.
Maybe not a half, but about a decade. When I moved to Portland for permanently would have been 2013. So yeah,
That's about right.
in there. It's when I came to Lake Oswego. Yeah.
Yeah. And we've done things together. So that's been really nice. Let me formally introduce you to our audience, please, and then we'll begin our conversation. So Dr. Terri Daniel is an interspiritual hospice chaplain and death educator. She is the creator of the Conference on Death, Grief, and Belief, and teaches the thanatology and teaches in the thanatology and chaplaincy programs at Marian University, the University of Maryland, and the Graduate Theological Union. So Terri, thanks so much for being here today. And I'd really like you to begin sharing with our audience what you've done to create grief rituals.
Well, I don't know that I've done anything to create grief ritual because grief ritual has been around forever.
It has been, but your grief rituals and what has been some of the things that have happened?
Well, I learned about ritual in general starting in 2009 when I went to the Conscious Dying program at the Four Winds Foundation, which was taught by Linda Fitch, a shamanic practitioner at the time. And I also met Austin Wells there, also a shamanic practitioner. And through my studies with shamanism, I learned about how to use ritual and why it's important and why it works. So that was my first introduction to it. After that, I really studied it a lot. I created programs with it. I did Simone Fusome's workshop, which I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with, which was African grief ritual specifically. So I just kind of jumped into it head first around 2009, 2010, right when I was launching the Afterlife Conference. And as I went through the next decade, in school, because I went back to school to get all these degrees and certifications, I incorporated it in everything I did, and everything I studied about grief and pastoral care and psychology. It was like, well, wait a minute, there are rituals that can address this. And so then in chaplaincy training and then beginning to work as a chaplain, I was seeing so many people in so much pain and, are people just holding so much trauma in their bodies that all the talk therapy in the world, or if they're spiritual, all the prayer and meditation in the world isn't going to do anything to release that from the body. There has to be a symbolic representation. For example, if you're holding a big bag of trauma inside you, and you can do something as simple as take a rock and blow into it. This is one of the shamanic processes. You do it 3 times, and every time you think about what I'm releasing from my body into this rock. And then you take the rock and you throw it in a river. Such a simple thing, but that's using representational external objects to hold the energy of the stuff that you're holding inside. And it actually does teach the neuroplasticity of the brain to understand that this is being released from here and being passed along into the wider universe. So that's kind of the foundational theory of why ritual is so important. And, we know that it's not used enough, if at all, in traditional talk therapy or in any really kind of therapy. So it's really a big deal. And it's starting to catch on now because of the internet, because we have a multicultural world and we're exposed to all these different practices. Little by little, it's coming into mainstream.
Hmm. And it's very interesting. You have developed some wonderful rituals that you and I participated in together at the center. And tell us about the rose petals in the bowl of water, please.
Well, that's one. In fact, if you go to my website, spiritualityandgrief.com, you'll find a little pull down menu for sample grief rituals, and you'll find a bunch of those there. That's a good place to look. So the rose petals, again, I learned from the shamans. And so this can be done a number of ways. There's no rules. You can modify and change and do anything you want with any of this. So just as an example, for releasing pain, if you're really holding a lot of pain and grief over somebody who died, let's say, we'll keep it in a grief context, one thing we would do is we would take 3 rose petals and you blow into them. And the reason you blow is because in many spiritual traditions, as we know, breath is sacred. It's the prana, it's the ruach, it's the soul. And also it forces you to do breath work, because when you're really grieving intensely, you're crunched up like this and you're not breathing and you're closed up over your lungs, right? So what it's really doing is getting you to open your lungs, which is really important. This is why crying is important. So you take the first rose petal and you blow into it all your anger and your rage and your guilt and all the bad stuff. Take the second rose petal and you blow in all the good stuff, the love that you have for that person, the forgiveness, all the beautiful stuff. And then the third red rose petal, you blow in a message that you want to give to that person. So that's one way to do it if you're grieving about a person. And then you can take the rose petals and do a number of different things with them. You can wrap them up into a little bundle and you can put things in that bundle, like, if it's your husband, maybe put your wedding ring in there and just make a little sacred bundle that you keep on your altar. Or you can put them in a bundle with a rock and throw that in the river. Or you can burn them, or you can just go out in the forest and sprinkle them in your garden. You can do anything. So another example of that is to do it at a funeral. So I did this at my mother's funeral, where I passed around a basket of rose petals. And I did exactly this. I did the thing with the 3 rose petals. First, you blow your sadness, then your love, then your message. And then when it was time to lower the coffin into the grave, I had everybody gather around and throw their rose petals in. Mm-hmm. So, there's no limit to what you can do with this. The only thing you need to know is that it's releasing energy and sending it somewhere, directing it somewhere. So what is that somewhere? It could be to the spirit of the person who died. It could be to God or Jesus or whatever you think that is, or anywhere, to the earth. Really works well to give it to the earth and the elements, because they are big enough to hold that kind of energy, bigger than we are.
Yes.
Or God or whatever.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's all the same.
And what I really appreciate is we don't have to have a word that works for everyone. It can be whatever it is for you, however you interpret it, your relationship with that person. Because what we know is that our brains experience grief. And so they are needing to be rewired and configured, and what's in our bodies needs to come out. Right. And that's why I do the work I do, allowing people to discover where grief lives in their body, be able then to recognize it, relate to it, and so it can be released. And exactly. I love, and not everybody's into that quietness. This is simple, and rose petals are available. So are rocks and roses. I think that could be a title of another book for you.
Rocks and roses. That's a title for something. Sure.
Well, you alluded to your training in shamanism and mentioned Linda and then Austin, and both of those people I have met at your conference. So you please tell your audience about the conference you created. Terri.
Well,
It's really evolved over time. Even the name has changed.
yeah. Well, it started out as the Afterlife Conference in 2010, and it was all about afterlife studies, after-death communication, mediumships, messages across dimensions, and of course, grief was part of that. And it was very successful like that for 10 years. And during those 10 years, however, I was in school getting, degrees in religious studies and theology. And what I was learning and what I was developing into my new area of interest and research is toxic theology and how certain theological structures and belief systems actually impede healing and recovery. I don't want to say recovery, restoration from grief.
Mhm.
And that became my doctoral dissertation. And so at that point, I had just moved on from the metaphysical focus. I spent 10 years focusing on that at the conference. It was all good, but I was just done with that. And now I wanted to go to something more practical, more academic. And I actually wanted to reach a different audience, an audience that, with the metaphysical audience at the Afterlife Conference, everybody had kind of landed on a belief system that worked for them, and they were comfortable and happy and well served there. I wanted to reach the people who hadn't landed anywhere and were very uncomfortable. And we're still in that search. Like, I don't believe in the heaven and hell traditional stuff, but I have nothing to replace that with. So I'm going to just be an atheist, but atheist has its own separate meaning, which has nothing to do with that. So I kind of wanted to reach that group because I was seeing in my chaplaincy work how many people were suffering with this, trying to fit their grief experience into a theological structure that had no room for it, that it just couldn't fit in. So, for example, I could talk about this forever, praying for an intervention for a loved one who's dying or a child or anything, and how harmful that can be if you believe that prayers are answered by some third party wish granting type of God that rewards you if you're pious or faithful enough. And so if you pray that this person is going to miraculously be healed of their cancer and then they're not and they die anyway, then you go into this spin about, what did I do wrong? Was my
I'm
faith
not good enough.
I'm not good enough. My faith isn't strong enough. So now, on top of having to grieve that death, now you have to go through this whole existential crisis,
Mhm.
That's rooted in shame and self-doubt. I mean, who needs that when they're grieving? Grief is hard enough.
It is indeed. And so you then are allowing people to have the awareness of the toxic beliefs that are keeping them stuck in their suffering or adding to it.
Yeah,
right?
or both, adding to
Mhm.
it and thus keeping them stuck. Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. Well, that's my hope. And so the conference is now called the Conference on Death, Grief, and Belief, and you can find it at deathgriefandbelief.com. And we also have a really big Facebook group.
Good. And that will be in the notes below our interview today, Terri, so people can go to that.
Great.
Because I believe that's probably where I first met you in 2010, was at the conference. A friend of mine came up from the San Francisco area. And so she stayed with me and we came out and went to that, and it was so enlightening. And she had heard about it probably through Ions or something like that. She was the one that let me know about it. And so we attended that, and it was just wonderful to see it evolve. And is it going to be, Terri, in person, online? And when's the next conference?
So the one you're thinking of, if it was in Portland, it would have been 2014.
Okay. And
that was
all
the
right.
first time we were in Portland.
Okay.
And it was live every year. We moved it around the country. We go East Coast, West Coast, middle, and rotate. But of course, at COVID, we stopped that. We started doing it virtually. So we did it 2 years virtually. Then last year we did it live again. And this year it's virtual again, and it will stay virtual because
Oh, good.
putting together a live conference is so much work. I just don't have the bandwidth for it anymore.
Mhm.
It's incredibly expensive. You have to just pull teeth to break even.
Mhm.
Because, when I do a conference, I include meals at the hotel. I mean,
Yes.
I give my speakers get paid and they get hotel rooms, and I spend
Yes.
a lot of money, and I just can't do that anymore. So it's going to
Mhm.
be virtual.
Well, and that's wonderful because so many of the people listening today do not have the energy to attend something online or in person.
Live,
And
yeah.
that's why this online is great. If you are a person that can barely get out of bed because of the heaviness of your grief, you can show up in your jammies or a sweater and your pajama bottoms and slippers and attend your conference. And it can be that releasing, expanding experience for people. So
Well, it's
thank you.
also economic. It's so
Mhm.
expensive to go to a conference. I mean, you have to fly somewhere and stay in
Right.
a hotel. It's just
Mhm.
not cost effective for the
Mhm.
promoter or the attendee.
Mhm. Mhm. So I'm really, really thankful to you for all the years that you've provided this service to us because the education is phenomenal and the experience, the transformation is what's so interesting. Yesterday, I was listening to a speaker who said, education without transformation is stagnation.
Mm.
And, we can take in, we can take in, we can take in. And at a certain point, if we don't allow that to permeate the cells of our body, rewire our brain, shift us in our consciousness and vibration, we do just sit and stagnate.
Well, that's why education has to be designed for people's particular learning style.
Mhm.
Most people don't learn by just sitting and listening to a lecturer. And that's why, in the classes that I teach, we do rituals, we do ceremonies, we do therapeutic processes and experiential stuff. People have to get up out of their chairs and move around and go places and do things.
And at each of these institutions that we heard in your introduction, is that all online then, Terri?
That's 100% online. So I got my doctorate in May 2019, which is very recent, and started teaching right after that, right when COVID started. So my first teaching job at the Graduate Theological Union, I lived in Northern California at the time, was in Berkeley, and I would have had to drive to Berkeley once a week, which just is the worst with the traffic and everything. And thankfully, COVID came along and they moved it online. And so did every other university. And then every teaching job I got after that, the universities realized the same thing that I have realized about the conference. If you teach online, you can get students from all over the world.
Mhm.
They don't have to live in your town and come to your campus. So the colleges get more students, way more,
Mhm.
by having their programs online. And I find that online teaching, and of course, I don't have a lot of experience with the other way, but they have to go pretty deep. They have to do a lot of reading. They have to write research papers. Then you also talk on Zoom. I think it's a really substantial education. I don't think anything's missing at all except the socializing part, but they'll just have to go do that in their own lives.
Well, and what I find wonderful about the online that we do at the Institute is we use breakout rooms.
Mhm.
And it's really interesting when two people share their experience of a process that takes them deeper so many times, at
Mhm.
least from my own experience as an attendee. Once a month, the Rubenfeld Synergy community gathers and we have a speaker and then we go into breakout rooms and it's just lovely. It's really neat.
Yeah, I was in that thing that you just watched that I did with Karen Wyatt. I don't know if that
Yes.
was there at the beginning of the conversation, but we were talking about it feels like I'm just sitting here talking to you. It's no
Yes.
different,
Mhm.
really.
Mhm.
at
Yes.
all that I can see. You know?
Right. And yes, plus we get to see each other's lovely backgrounds.
Yeah.
And so you've been to my home this morning.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
learn a lot about the person by their Zoom background.
You do. It's very interesting. So I know you're not a grief therapist. Is there something, though, that you would say to those people grieving who are listening to our conversation, Terri, that I say to them, grieve every day? A woman recently called me and said, I need you. My husband just dropped dead today. I went to her house. I sat with her and her two children, and she said, how do I do this? And I said, you do it one breath at a time, you stay in the present moment, and you grieve every day. And then I answered many, many questions, and we did things together. What would you say, Terri, with your vast years of experience and so many trainings, to someone who asked that question?
Well, in addition to everything else I do, I also work for a hospice here in Portland as a chaplain. And I recently just now became also the bereavement coordinator. So I make the follow-up calls to the bereaved people within a week after the death, and then again a month after the death. So I have that conversation every day. And I wouldn't even attempt to answer that question. I would just say, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I would just say, you just make friends with it. Feel what you feel. Number one, most important thing you need is social support. And, I would give them some things like you have to have people around you to take care of you, but not everybody needs the same degree of that. So balance your time between talking with people, having people come over and sit with you, and then being alone. It's okay to be alone too. Just balance. I would also give them the loss and restoration tracking sheet that I teach, maybe not in the first week, but maybe around the third month. Depends where they are in the process.
Sure. And this was a one-time visit, and we knew each other from a previous relationship. And so that's why we did some cleansing breath. We just, and answered questions. So thank you very much
Well, I
for
would
your
also just
answer.
add, that the basics of human survival: breathe, eat, drink,
Yes,
sleep, talk. Have however many things those were, 5, whatever.
They were.
It was 5. Yeah, those are, breathe, eat, drink, sleep, talk. I mean, there's probably an acronym in there we could build.
Yes. Well, we've got the 5-star at least, and I use that in my certification program. What are the 5 things we all need every day?
Yeah. So, and that's really all. And something else I've learned about helping bereaved people is there's absolutely nothing you can do, and there's nothing you should do. There's nothing to do.
Yes.
There's
that
nothing
being
to do.
there with them, present with them, is the greatest gift we can give them.
And don't talk. Let them talk. And this is something that we get trained for really intensely in chaplaincy, is how to not talk and how to create a space that invites the other person to talk. And so we don't advise, we don't even tell them to breathe, well, maybe we'll tell them that, but it's all about letting them have a chance to be heard when it's in that initial acute, grief. Now, a year later, if you're talking to somebody who's still perseverating and obsessing over the details of the death and just wants to talk and talk and talk about that, that's when we're getting into some problematic, possibly pathological grief responses, which is another topic, prolonged grief disorder. We can talk about that if you want, or not.
Sure. Tell us a little bit more about that, because the literature is saying, the grief researchers are saying, George Bonanno is the person I'm referring to in this moment. Healthy grief is 2 years. And you tell us about the prolonged grief you were just speaking of.
It's very controversial in the
It
field.
is.
And to lay a number on it is not a good idea. Healthy grief is 2 years for who?
That's right.
Or,
It wasn't for me. I
yeah.
don't know if it was for you,
Well,
Terry.
for
It
an
wasn't for me.
85-year-old person whose
Mhm,
husband dies after years of Alzheimer's,
mhm,
2 years, it would not be healthy at all. And then it
mhm.
depends, like, what are they doing during those 2 years?
Yes.
How are they behaving? So
Mhm,
I
mhm.
just had a conversation with Robert Niemeyer about this just the other day. And he pointed something out to me. He said, you have to separate feeling from function.
Tell us more.
So you can feel bad and sad for 20 years,
Mhm.
but is it impairing your functioning?
Ah.
And so the way you really assess healthy grief is, how are you functioning? Are you
Mhm.
eating, sleeping, breathing, and talking? Are you able to go to work and have a social life? Did you, after your husband died, did you sell the house and move to a new house and decorate it the way you like? Or how are your relationships with your children? There's all these factors that you want to look at. And that's how you determine healthy grieving. And it has nothing to do with time, because there's so many different kinds of deaths. It's very
Mhm.
different if it's your 80-year-old mother or your 5-year-old kid.
That's right. It
You
really
can't,
is.
so you can't just put that all in the same pot.
Mhm. But go back to what you were speaking about, and I think you deepened it with what Robert had said,
Mhm.
and for you to be able to say, when a year later the story goes on and on and on, then what, Terry?
Well, again, we have to still look at all those other factors. Just because the person's obsessing about the story, that's maybe just one point, one
Mhm,
criterion. What else is going on with them? Are they not sleeping? Are they eating too much, drinking too much, or not eating and drinking?
mhm.
Did they lose their job? Are they sitting at home watching TV all day? You got to look at all that stuff. So
Yes.
let's say that the person checks all those boxes that look very much like depression, which is why they added complicated grief in the DSM to separate it from depression. Then with my hospice clients, what I would do is I would consider them like a moderate or high risk, and, suggest other interventions for them. Like, we have trained volunteers who can just call them on the phone and talk to them for an hour a week. Or we would refer them to a therapist. And at that point, that's beyond what we can do at hospice.
Sure.
It's beyond what I would do, because
Mhm,
I'm not a licensed grief therapist.
mhm,
And it's not really what I do anyway. So,
mhm.
I have a good list of therapists, and, go get therapy. There are people who have been in therapy for years,
Yes.
who have so many other factors in their life that they're just not gonna regain balance, because they've got other mental health issues going on,
Mhm.
and they've had them for years before the loss. And
Yes.
so this is something Bonanno would say, what is their capacity for resilience? Are
Yes.
they able to make decisions and make changes in their life and act on them? Are
Mhm.
they able to articulate their needs and seek solutions to problems? There are some people, some clients that we've all run into, that are basically a solution looking for a problem,
Yes.
right? No matter what you give them, their
That's
answer
right.
is no.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
so Niemeyer calls this a pro-symptom position. They are in favor of their symptoms.
Yes. Their
And they
condition has become them.
exactly.
Mhm.
And that goes very deep. That goes, beyond. I mean, I can give somebody tools for that, but if they're not willing to release that, there's nothing anybody can do.
That's exactly right. We had a conversation in my office just last week, Terry, with a client whose grief is manifesting as anxiety. And I experienced anxiety when I got divorced. And in all of the other losses that I'd had, I never experienced it. So this person was talking about my anxiety. And at that point, it was like, oh, this has become an identity.
Mhm.
So we talking about the anxious feelings, describing what was happening rather than owning what was happening. And then
Ah,
that way they're put some distance between that. And as you were talking, I was thinking it would be so neat to take the rock and blow their anxiety.
Exactly. I was just going to say that. So take it one step further and separate it visually and physically. Like, okay, here's your anxiety.
That's right.
Here's your peace. It's white.
Yes.
And take this piece of anxiety and just like draw an angry picture on it and throw it away, burn it in a fire, and do that every day if you have to. And I am sure that would help.
Yes. Yes. So thank you so much. How lovely that this whole conversation has come back to a simple ritual, you see.
Yeah.
And once again, getting it outside of the body and this person, and sending it off as something that no longer belongs to them. You know, they've related to it and they can release it then.
And I have had clients actually say to me when I present them something like that, I don't want to do that. I've had, and you know, that's good self-awareness. I'm not ready to do that yet. I need my anxiety. I still want it.
And that, once again, that it's just like we were talking about earlier, it's very individual for every person. And that's why the basic concepts that we're talking about, the processes that we're talking about, are there as education that can be transformational for those for whom this works. It's not one size fits all. You and I both know that.
Yeah. And I'd say for those who have an anti-symptom perspective, I want to get rid of my symptoms. And so for that person who says, I don't want to get rid of my anxiety, I'm not ready, I still want it, it's my friend, I would say, okay, let's talk about what do you get from it? What does it give you? As your friend, what kind of friend is she?
What's the benefit?
What's the benefit
of having anxiety as a friend? Yes.
Yeah.
We've done that too. Well, this is interesting because this brings me to the very, very powerful paper that was just published that you wrote. And tell us the name, tell us the journal, and tell us about the paper, please.
It's called The Stubborn Persistence of Grief Stage Theory, and it was published in the Omega Journal of Death and Dying, I think in January. And the reason I wrote it, and there's been a million articles written on this, it's nothing new, but I came with a little bit of a different angle, which is why they published it.
And that's why we want to hear it from you today.
And basically, you know, I kind of analyzed, like, why is this 5 stages of grief thing still around when any professional worth their salt has known for 20 years that it's not a viable theory? Nobody uses it. And if you come into exposure to a therapist who talks to you about what stage you're in, run, don't walk out the door and find another therapist. Everybody, well, I shouldn't say everybody knows this. A lot of people don't know this. So why is it still around and why do people still cling to it?
So we're talking about the 5 stages of grief that are attributed to Dr. Kubler-Ross.
Right. And I'll go into a little bit of the history. So in 1965, I think it was, she was a researcher in Switzerland. And she did some research in a hospital with dying people who were terminally ill. She interviewed about 200 people for her book. This was not a university-funded, peer-reviewed study. It was just interviews for the book she was going to write. And she found that of these 200 people, they had all these different reactions, of course, to their impending death. But when she sort of sussed it all out and boiled it down, there were 5 of the most common reactions: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, with no particular value on any of them. These were the 5 most common responses. And she published this book, and for some reason, she called them the 5 stages of grief. It's in her book that way. That didn't get a whole lot of attention. It did in the death and dying community, but fast forward now into 1990-ish, somewhere in there, a guy named David Kessler comes along and meets her. And he has this idea of, let's blow up this 5 stages of grief idea and publish a new version of your book, your 5 stages of grief, and let's death, and let's call it, instead of your book, which is called On Death and Dying, we'll call it On Grief and Grieving, and we'll promote this 5-stage idea. And she said, yeah. And they made a deal and they wrote a book and it became this huge bestseller. And that's number one.
Okay.
How it got so popular. And it continues to be popularized pretty much because David Kessler keeps it going.
Okay.
Now, there's a second reason, and that's social media. So the other reason it keeps going is that because today anybody can hang a shingle and call themselves a grief coach with no training, nothing. And they don't read the research and they don't have a master's degree and they don't study anything. And they do like a weekend workshop which, by the way, David Kessler teaches and certifies people to be this type of grief guide. And then they're out there writing books and having blogs and doing private practice, teaching this stage theory. So that's another reason why, is that there are unqualified, uneducated people out there selling grief services without being up to speed on current grief theory.
Okay. And so what has been the response to your article?
In the professional world, people love it. I haven't had any complaints about it, though. A couple of people have said, but I like the 5 stages. It really worked for me. I went through those 5 stages. And my answer is, yeah, you did. Maybe you had all 5 of those responses, but you probably also had 25 other responses in addition to those 5. And there's a new study that just came out that I actually mentioned in my article about how people in society will make their responses match with whatever they're told they're supposed to have.
Yes.
So they did this whole study where people say, oh yeah, I went through denial and bargaining, because that's all they know. And so if somebody says there are only 3 colors, red, blue, and green, what are you going to do when you see yellow? No one ever told you that yellow exists. So you're going to make your idea of yellow be more like green. Right. And so people actually do this. And so, of course, the general public doesn't read academic research, which I think is a shame. I mean, these academic research articles, you have to have access to an academic university library, or have to know how to find them online. And then you have to buy them if you don't have access. So your average person doesn't read this stuff. And you don't see academic researchers being interviewed on, on Oprah, or whatever, so people aren't getting the good information. They're just getting the pop psychology information.
Is there any way our listeners can access the actual article? Is there a link?
Oh yeah, I'll send you my article. When I want people to see these articles. So when I have an academic article, I send everybody the link to it. So if someone wants it, just email me. And if I type it in the chat room, will people see it, Georgena, or do you have to?
Actually, what you may do is go ahead and do that. Type it in the chat, and then we'll make sure, Terri, that your contact information is below the interview.
Okay.
So that people can email you if they want a copy of the article, is what I'm hearing. Did I get it?
Email me, tell me you want a copy of the article, and I'll send it to you.
Good.
Actually, another thing I can do is just put, no, let's do it that way.
That left. Yeah. Yes. And that's the email that I always use with you.
Yeah.
So that's the email that we'll put down below.
And also, since you're putting things in your notes, let's put this in here too, is the conference.
Oh, yes. The dates of the conference. And
July 8th and 9th.
Yes. Okay, that's great. Excellent. Okay, super. And I will save that for us then too. Good. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, my goodness, I was expecting us to go on and on, knowing how when the two of us get together, we do talk and talk. And I've covered the questions and the things that I wanted to today. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our listeners before we go, Terri?
I'll say, I don't know, your demographic exactly, but for people who want to be grief counselors or death doulas, I would recommend a couple of things. And, I'm going to sound kind of snobbish when I say this, but, a weekend workshop where you get a certificate as a death doula without any supervised clinical hours doesn't count for anything. It's great for you. You'll learn some good stuff. You'll be really good at helping your family members when they die, but you cannot walk into a hospice or a hospital with that certificate and get any sort of job. So I recommend you can get a thanatology certificate at Marian University, where I teach, and also at University of Maryland. You don't have to do the whole master's degree program. You can just do the certificate program. But if you really want some skills and some experience, go be a hospice volunteer. And if you're interested in hospice volunteering, we're actually looking for some at my hospice in Portland. If you're in Portland, email me. I'll tell you where to go for that. But get clinical experience, that, the bedside experience, not the experience you had taking care of your mom at her bedside, but somebody who's not your mom. And so, I believe there may be one or two doula programs that includes a requirement for that. But I don't know what they are, but look for them. And the same with the grief programs. The best grief program, if you want training and a certificate in grief support, go to the portlandinstitute.org. That is hands down the best, the only program that has the kind of legitimacy that I'm talking about. And, you can do this whole program. I think it's about 60 hours. It's between $2,500 and $3,000. And you will get a certificate in, there's 4 different things: family-focused grief therapy, art therapy, whatever. Portlandinstitute.org is also a really, really good credential.
And Robert was my guest just prior to you.
Oh.
And so, yes, so we'll be posting his interview on May the 9th, and then yours to follow later in the month. And so, yes, so we have the link to
excellent.
for
Perfect.
people on that. Yes, because it is so important that the concepts and our presence be there for the grieving person. We have to have that educational quality background, but we also need the training in presence. And that's what you were talking about, Terri, when you were talking about the chaplaincy program. Having being so present that your being there is an invitation for someone to speak.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah, you are the invitation.
You are the invitation.
Yeah.
And that takes a great deal of awareness, because silence is so uncomfortable in our culture that we want to fill it up. In our suicide bereavement support groups that we have in person and online through sbsnw.org, and I'll put that link below because we haven't, I guess, in the past. But we create those spaces of silence so that those people that require time to process and really get in touch with what it is they want to say have the space to do that.
Right. And in the rest of their world, not the world that they're sitting in with us.
Yes.
The rest of the world, everybody's trying to suffocate that space. Everybody's trying to get them to stop feeling their pain. They're trying to reassure them. And my favorite phrase that I love to use is reassurance devalues suffering.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
And that's your phrase.
No, it's not mine. I actually heard it from a social worker giving a presentation at a conference
Okay.
somewhere.
Would you say it again, please, for our listeners?
Reassurance devalues suffering. It's
Mhm.
very much a chaplaincy thinking, and
Mhm.
your typical grieving person surrounded by friends and family, they're just heaping all this stuff on them to make them stop suffering, which is basically,
Mhm.
I am not comfortable with your suffering.
That's right.
So please don't suffer in front of me. Here, have a
Mhm.
Kleenex. He's in a
Mhm.
better place now. He's with God now. Everything happens for a reason. You'll be over it in 2 months. I mean, all this, it's all about saying, what they're really saying is, I cannot be with your suffering.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
And we know, you and I and the people that are listening today, that suffering, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional, and sometimes we cause our own suffering, and there is suffering when we've had a huge loss.
Yeah. And so I don't think suffering is optional. I think suffering is also necessary, but you don't live there. You don't want to live.
That's it.
You
Okay,
want to
good.
work with it.
So pain is inevitable, suffering is inevitable, and you don't want to live it. You know what I say, Terri? Don't build a condo in the valley,
Mhm.
in the valley of grief.
Mhm.
Don't
Yeah.
build a condo there.
Yeah.
Because it's
Yeah.
a journey through the valley.
Yeah, exactly.
It really is.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being here today with all that you've brought to us. It's been a pleasure. And so to each of you that are listening, Terri was very sincere when she made the offer to you to email her for a copy of the paper. And so look for the conference link below this podcast or YouTube, whichever place you're going, so that you can continue on this journey with Terri. Thank you so much to all of you listening today.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Georgena.
You're welcome.